Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Ximena Leon Oxy Honey Processed Ecuador from Monta Coffee Co. And there's the box right there. And Monta, based out of Leesburg, Virginia. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had limited familiarity with going into this review. At the beginning of the year, the owner of Monta, Jaime, reached out to us to introduce himself and this coffee roaster, and Jaime is Ecuadorian, which is one of the main reasons why the majority of coffees that Monta offers are Ecuadorian coffees. But in addition to that, it's one of the main reasons why they're able to offer some unique coffees as well, as Monta is the only coffee roaster I've seen carrying this specific honey-processed Mejorado. Since our initial introduction, Jaime has sent us some samples of Monta's coffees, including the collaboration that they did with Brian Kwan. But as always, I told him to reach out to us when there was a coffee that they wanted to showcase, and we would go ahead and purchase it. And this is the coffee that they recommended. So we went ahead and purchased it, and it'll definitely be interesting to see how it turned out, as this right here is day 38. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a toned down one at a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which does indicate a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee, I mentioned that we had an opportunity to try a couple of samples from them earlier this year, and of the 3 coffees that we did try from them, this one was actually the lightest. And interestingly enough, I went back and took a look at the description of all 3 of those coffees, and all 3 of them were listed as their filter offering, which does indicate that they do have a filter and non-filter profile for their coffees. That being said, those initial impressions weren't necessarily the lightest, as I can say they skewed a little bit closer to a more developed side of a medium light. This one, on the other hand, though, as mentioned, was a little lighter than those, so I feel like it's a little closer to a true medium, as in comparison, we are working on a coffee from Lil Wolf, and this one is notably lighter than that coffee, so hopefully that gives you a good idea. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was off to an interesting start, as there is an aroma of fermentiness, but it does present a little less in the cup, as it's offering a fruit sweetness that's in line with the illicit peachiness. Otherwise, there's a pretty well-defined raspberry jam with a solid level of clarity, lending itself towards a nice first impression. And when I mentioned that aroma, it definitely did give me a bit of concern that this coffee might skew a little too heavy in a fermenty sense, given that right from the start, I did have a little bit of skepticism seeing that red raspberry note on this coffee. And given that it is a little bit more processed of an Ecuadorian coffee, I definitely had some pretty big concerns that that's the direction that this coffee was going to go. I wouldn't say that this first impression alleviated those concerns, but I did really appreciate the way that that red fruit presented this time around. Day 17 through the Chemex, and the coffee is nice again. There's definitely a lot of intensity to it, but it's still presenting in a generally cleaner sense, even with these strong red fruit characteristics. A little less clean this time around though, as there's a bit more fermentiness presented with less definition to the peach and a fair bit more brightness. So this is kind of skewing a little bit closer in the direction that I was anticipating for this coffee. And right off the bat, I kind of got the impression that this coffee wasn't going to benefit from being pushed, but even then, we'll continue to go through our natural progression, as on day 20 we opted for the UFO brewer, and there's a similar feeling, as the coffee is a nice combination of intensity and cleanliness with the prominent red fruit qualities present yet again. Another very straightforward day, didn't have too much to add, as of this moment the coffees have been essentially red fruit but not overly red fruit heavy, and a little bit of peach but not necessarily in the most well-defined sense. So it's going to be interesting to see what direction the coffee would go with, as on day 23 we opted for the V60 with Monta's recipe, which is a 17:1 at 92 degrees Celsius recipe. And the coffee was a little bit more fermenty than it had been up to this point, so my initial impression was that this coffee was probably just naturally skewing in that direction, as the adjustments we made were probably a bit similar to the direction that we were planning on going with this coffee anyway. We would have gone a little bit higher on the concentration, so a 15:1 as opposed to that 17:1, but I definitely would have lowered the temperatures. There still was a nice, lovely candied stone fruit within the finish, which was the most enjoyable aspect of this coffee on this day, so a lot more of a mixed impression, as of this moment, the coffee's been a little bit mixed overall. Day 26 through the Chemex with Monta's recipe, and it's cleaner today, as it has been slightly inconsistent so far. As this time around, I can say that there's a clear, canned, tropical fruit sense to it. Significantly less of the red fruit qualities as well, allowing for a better definition to the tropical aspects in a cleaner sense. And it did remind me a lot of those canned fruits that I had when I was a lot younger as a kid. And in that sense, it was just kind of mixed because yes, it was sweet. Yes, it was a little bit cleaner, but even then I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of just how prominent and intense those specific tropical fruits were, given that it did seem to come at a little bit of the cost of cleanliness. Day 29 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, so 15-1 at 93 degrees Celsius, and that's the direction I was originally planning on going. And the coffee is nice, but not quite as clean as expected given the adjustments. It is almost reminiscent of what I would describe as shock tarts, as there's plenty of the listed red fruit qualities in a sugary powdered candy sense this time around, so shock tarts were the main thing that came to mind on this day. Day 32 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and this was definitely one of the best days of the coffee that we had had up to this point, as there was notably less fermentiness to it, which definitely allowed for a significantly better definition to the red raspberry qualities in a much cleaner sense. Tropical again, yet Mejorado-like in the brown candied sweetness that was pretty notable and abundant within the finish this time around. So I definitely found a very nice experience on this day, as the red fruit characteristics were something that we couldn't avoid throughout the entirety of this coffee, but the focal point based off the early impressions was that we can get it presented in a clean and well-defined sense without too much of that fermentiness. And this experience definitely demonstrated that, as it was the best defined and cleanest that we'd experienced up to this point. So on day 35, we went back to the Chemex with the same adjustments, and there's actually a bit more depth to this coffee than what we've previously mentioned, as it is relatively full-bodied with an extremely high level of sugary brown candy Mejorado-like sweetness to it, a slight citric blossom for the florality, and a apple tart lemon berry brightness to it in an intense sense. Plenty of the red raspberry characteristics and sweet lemon qualities with a slight peach component to it as well. So pretty deep, it's pretty heavy, it's pretty intense, it's pretty in your face, but at the same time it offers enough cleanliness to balance all of those characteristics out. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see where we're getting. And we have one level 5, so let's go through that one real quick, and that is the sweetness level 5. This coffee is wildly sweet, and in theory, going into it, you would expect this coffee to be pretty sweet, given that it is a Mejorado coffee and it is a slightly more processed Mejorado coffee. In general, when we've had more processed Mejorado coffees, they can be overbearing and too sweet. And this coffee, while it is sweet in the fruit sense and in a slightly candied sense, it's much more that Mejorado sweetness just toned up. So those toffee-like characteristics, those caramelized characteristics, that just very lingering, long-lasting brown candied quality to this one. As with washed Mejorado, sometimes they can be a little bit in the background in a more subtle sense, but this one is much more in your face. So for those that have maybe struggled in the past to taste that specific characteristic when it comes to Mejorado coffees, this one makes it about as transparent as possible, as it's a very sweet experience in that regard. A bunch of level 4s. We'll go through them. We'll start with the body level 4. As mentioned, this one was a very full-bodied and thick cup of coffee, which in itself is very interesting, especially given the recipe we opted for, the brew method that we opted for, which of course was the Chemex. And I was really surprised when making this tasting wheel, as I made this tasting wheel alongside a couple of other coffees that we were working on at the same time, and I said, this coffee is the most full-bodied of these coffees, and those weren't slouches either. So for that reason, we scored this one pretty high. Don't score too many coffees at level 4 for body, but this one definitely had plenty of texture to it. We'll go ahead and move past the cleanliness for now. We'll go to the finish, level 4. The finish on this coffee is definitely an interesting one. Since it's a little bit more processed, you do get a little bit more of that lingering brightness to this one. So we can kind of discuss this alongside of the acidity, which is there at that level 4. And I mentioned a couple of things. It does have that Mejorado apple-like acidity to it, that apple-like sweetness as well. So you get a little bit of that. It is bright in the berry sense, as you do have a little bit of tartness in that red raspberry sense, and also a little bit of that citric brightness to it. So the brightness has depth, and I know that's appealing to a lot of people, but it's also what seems to be the most lasting quality of this coffee, coupled alongside the sweeter Mejorado-like characteristics. So it's a very interesting finish. It's not overly intense, it's not overbearing, it's not too long lasting, but it does finish a little bit more even. So level 4, where we opted to put that in the acidity, which we'll just go ahead and skip past since we already discussed that. I'm going to move on to the berry fruit, level 4. The raspberry note that I saw in here, when I was originally purchasing this coffee, I was just curious to see how it was going to translate in this coffee. I've said before that a lot of red fruit characteristics are huge red flags for me going into coffees that aren't washed. Even washed Colombian coffees, they can be a red flag for. But this one right here did a very good job of presenting it in a cleaner sense. And I'll be completely honest, I feel like if we would have pushed this coffee a little bit more, even on the early days when we kept it at a more standard recipe, it was a little more fermenty than I would particularly like. But toning this coffee down, I was able to get it to a level where it is pretty well defined, and it is possible to have that raspberry characteristic without that overly fermented quality to it. And this one, I feel like, did one of the better jobs that I've experienced from a coffee this year, which is why we scored that at level 4 and another important part of this tasting wheel. Citrus fruit, level 4. There was a little bit more of a lemon characteristic to it than there was a peach quality. On the earlier days, I can see a little bit more of a peachiness, but towards the end, I can definitely say that it was skewing away from that a little bit more in the brighter senses. It does feel like this coffee might be starting to lose a little bit of structure, but I can't necessarily tell. Even then, the peachiness, which was a little bit more direct on the earlier days, hasn't been as consistent throughout the entirety of this coffee, so level 3 is where we opted to put that. Okay, and then we will discuss a handful of level 3s. We will start with the florality level 3. Not the most floral coffee. I can see a little bit of that honey florality, and I can see a little bit of a citric florality to it as well. But even then, it's a little bit more medium level, so that's why we opted to put it there at that level 3. Spice is kind of interesting. I put it there because I can see a little bit of a cinnamon characteristic to this one as well. I'm saying that there's a lot of depth and intensity to this coffee, so that's why we kept that also at a pretty medium level within this one. Stone fruit, already touched on that briefly. Chocolate, level 3. It does have a pretty sweet milk chocolate-like characteristic to it as well, and I feel like that's a component of this one being a South American coffee, but even then, Mejorado coffees don't always have that specific quality, but given that there's just so much sweetness to this coffee, I was able to see it in that direction as well. Caramel, level 3. It can probably be a little bit higher than that. I think that maybe the fruit characteristics were a little bit more abundant than that specific brown candy Mejorado-like quality to this one. Those are going to be the things that most people notice, primarily because that's at the forefront. That's where a lot of the brightness from this coffee comes as well. So level 3 is where we opted to keep the caramel aspect of this one. And then the final thing we're discussing, and by far the most important thing we're discussing, the cleanliness, level 4. I mentioned it briefly that if this coffee was pushed and on the earlier days, it's probably closer to level 3, but on that final day I said it's holding up nice enough. It's holding up to the point where I can justify this one being at the level 4 because the qualities in this coffee are very defined. They are very transparent. That red fruit quality isn't fermenty. And if anything, I was getting very little fermentiness, very little funk to this coffee, especially for it being a oxy honey processed coffee. So I said, it's clean enough for a level 4. I wouldn't blame anybody that kept it at level 3, lower side of level 4. However we wanted to chart it, it's between that category. It's not necessarily a true level 4. At its very best, it's a lower level 4, but it was clean enough for me on this final day to justify it being there. I didn't want to conflate the overall intensity and sweetness for just how much cleanliness and clarity there actually was to this coffee. So perhaps a little generous, but I did opt to put it there. So as a result, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I think I still have the same sentiment that I've had with a lot of other processed Mejorado coffees. I feel like it's oftentimes unnecessary, largely because wash processed Mejorado coffees already have enough sweetness and intensity to them. If they are done well, if they are done right, I feel like they're one of the few varietals that rarely, if ever, benefits from additional processing, as I haven't liked any natural processed Mejorado with the exception of the samples that we had of the natural processed Mejorado from H&S last year at some point. And maybe the one that we ordered from them this year might also be pretty good, but outside of that, the slightly more processed Mejorado coffees, same sentiment. I just feel like I have such a strong preference for wash processed with that one specifically. But this one did offer an interesting experience given it had plenty of those Mejorado characteristics to it, but the rest of the coffee was still pretty intense and it held up well enough in terms of the cleanliness. So there's a lot of positives to take away from this one, and I feel like those that have maybe wanted a little bit more of a intense experience from their Mejorado coffees can lean a little bit more into this one, which does take us to the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you have wanted a little bit more intensity from your Mejorado coffees, you have wanted more fruit sweetness from them, more fruit brightness to them as well, then I feel like this one's going to be a pretty good fit as it offered that in a number of different ways. As mentioned, the acidity was a pretty interesting one given just how much depth there was to that characteristic as well. All in a very sweet experience with some very nice level of cleanliness. So that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Ximena Leon Oxy Honey Processed Ecuador from Monta Coffee Co. Thank you for watching.